So we are getting into our first set of senses notes. So we have here the ear, and we're going to start with hearing, and we're going to stay in the ear and also talk about balance. So here's the basic anatomy of the ear. You have the external part of the part of the ear that you see, which we call the pinna, and then we also have the auditory canal, which is going to be, you might also call it your ear canal, and that opening that leads to the auditory canal is called the external auditory meatus. The auditory canal then leads down to a thin membrane called the tympanic membrane, but you are probably more familiar with it as your eardrum. Then behind the eardrum, you have three bones. These are the smallest bones in the body. They are called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. They also have the names hammer, anvil, and stirrup. The hammer because it looks like a little hammer, and then you have the anvil, which is just what the hammer is striking, and then the stirrup because it looks like a horse stirrup. Now, you also have in this space the escutcheon tube. The escutcheon tube is actually open to the nasopharynx. So that tube actually leads down into the nose and back of the mouth. And I should say back of the nose, really. So that tube, if you've ever had a cold or congestion, that escutcheon tube can actually fill up with mucus and put pressure on the eardrum from behind. And when you clear that pathway, you can often feel your eardrum pop because you've now relieved pressure in that escutcheon tube. If you've ever gone up a mountain or gone in an airplane and had to pop your ears, what you're doing is you're trying to open up that escutcheon tube so that you can get the air pressure equalized on both sides of the eardrum. Moving into the inner ear section, we have the semicircular canals, and we're going to come back to those a little bit later because those are really more involved with balance rather than with hearing. And then we also have the cochlea. The cochlea is the part of the inner ear that is responsible for receiving information about sound. And then we have the vestibular nerve, which is going to be responsible for relaying balance information to the brain. And then we have the cochlear nerve, which is responsible for transmitting information about sound to the brain. The round window is also part of the cochlea. There's also a matching oval window, but the oval window sits underneath the stapes. That's what it's resting in, and you can't see it in this picture because the stapes is in place. So here's that oval window. Like I said, the stapes would normally sit here. And that's why I threw this picture in here so that you could see the oval window as well as the round window. So let's talk a little bit about how sound is relayed. In the ear, we have mechanoreceptors. So the type of receptors we find in the ear are mechanoreceptors. So they respond to changes in structure, in physical shape. And so we need to displace them in order to get information. Luckily for us, the type of receptors that we see in the inner ear are hair-like projections, those cilia that you see here. Those are going to actually bend, and that's what's going to relay the information. When those little hair-like projections bend, then we transmit that to the brain, and the brain interprets it as sound. So how do we get them to bend? So all sound is vibration in the air. So that vibration hits the eardrum and causes it to vibrate in the same frequency as the wave itself. That is then transmitted down the hammer to the anvil and then to the stirrup, or from the malleus to the incus to the stapes. And then the stapes is going to push against the oval window. And when it pushes against the oval window, it's going to displace the fluid inside of the cochlea. That is the perilymph and endolymph. Those are the fluids inside of the cochlea, and those are going to be displaced. So they're going to flow as fluids do. And when they flow, they are going to bend those cilia. And like I said, when those cilia bend in the organ of Corti, that is what the auditory nerves pick up. They pick up that bending. And each of the cilia bends at a different frequency. So some bend at higher frequencies, and so are only really going to relay information when they're hearing high frequency noises. And then we have some that register lower frequency. As you age, you actually lose some of the hairs. Some of the hairs die. And particularly around higher frequencies, those are the ones that die first because they're very, very delicate, because they have to be able to move with very, very minimal displacement. So we lose the higher frequency sounds first as we age. There are some neuroscientists that think this might be one of the reasons that as we age, we lose the appreciation of modern music, because music that we heard when we were teenagers or in our early 20s, we could hear the full spectrum of the song. But as we age, we lose that ability to hear that top frequency, and so we're not hearing the song completely. Now, why don't we just lose appreciation for all music? Well, the reason is music that we've heard before, our brain can fill in the gaps. We know what that song is supposed to sound like. So even though we haven't lost the upper range of our hearing, our brain will automatically fill in the gaps because we've heard it before. We know what it's supposed to sound like, so we can still appreciate it. Whereas with newer songs, we don't know what the song is supposed to sound like because we've never heard it before. And so we can't appreciate the full song because we're not hearing the full song. So I always think that is an interesting tidbit around like differences in ages and kind of explaining something that we see socially. I always find that interesting when we have an anatomy reason for that. So this is just a cross section of the cochlea, just kind of showing you how these tubes are arranged. So the cochlea has these 3 tubes, and you can see the organ of Corti here, and this is where those cilia are going to be located, and then you can see the cochlear nerves coming out of that. And then just the same thing here, just labeled for you. And so you can see that organ of Corti with those hair-like projections. And then this is, like I said, the fluid is going to fill in this tube, and that's what's going to help the displacement for those cilia so that when they bend, we can relay that information. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the balance sense. So here is kind of a 3D scan of a cochlea and the attached semicircular canals. So you will notice these big loops coming off of the cochlea here. So those 3 big loops are called the semicircular canals. We have the anterior, which points straight up like this. We have the posterior, and which is at 90 degrees to the anterior. And then you have the horizontal, which is at 90 degrees to both of them and obviously sits horizontally. And then the things that we are going to kind of focus on are the urticle and the saccule. Those are going to be the main places that we're going to talk about when we start talking about functionality. And then we have the vestibular nerve, and you can see those running along the cochlear nerve, and then of course the cochlea here. This is called the vestibular system. This is another name for the balance system, is the vestibular system. So let's talk a little bit about how balance works. So as you position yourself in space, so as you move your head or you move your body, you are going to shift the fluid that's found inside the semicircular canals. That fluid then flows through these canals and also displaces the fluid in the urticle and the saccule. However, the fluid in the urticle and saccule is not alone. It has the specialized hair-like projections that we see here, those sensory hair cells. And those, just like the ones we talked about in the cochlea, are going to bend as the fluid moves around them. And those shifts are going to be picked up by the vestibular nerve. And those hair-like projections are helped along in that ability to shift and move by the otoconia. The otoconia are really interesting. You can see them here, but you can also see them in here. They are tiny microscopic crystals, and those crystals sit on top of the fluid because it's slightly gelatinous and because they're so very tiny that they don't have enough mass to really sink, so that they're not dense enough, I should say, to sink. And so they sit on top of that fluid and they help displace it. And that fluid then transmits that movement to those hair-like projections that then is picked up by the hair cells. Now, the interesting thing about the otoconia is that they can actually become dislodged. They can actually break free of this fluid, and they can fall into the semicircular canals. If you've ever experienced vertigo or know someone who has, that is how vertigo most likely happens. That is the most common cause of vertigo, is for the otoconia to detach excuse me, from their position in the urticle and the saccule and fall into the semicircular canals. And they do the same thing once they're in the semicircular canals. They displace the fluid, and that fluid then transmits back into the urticle. And so what you have is fluid displacement that doesn't track with what your eyes and the rest of your body are sending to the brain. Because while the vestibular system is the primary portion of balance, there are other senses that are also providing information. Like if you are spinning around like a top, then you would, of course, your body is remaining basically stationary, and your eyes are not seeing enough of your surroundings to help your vestibular system to make conclusions. So that's why we get dizzy, is we have a miscommunication where we are moving but staying in place, and our eyes don't have enough information to really explain, for our brain to really explain what's going on. And so that's why you have that sensation of dizziness, is it's your brain trying to catch up with all of the sensory information that you're taking on. So if we have a situation where we have fluid displaced in the ear, but we do not have a corresponding reason from our eyes, then that is where we get that vertigo feeling. Like our eyes can be telling us, oh, we just sat up, we just stood up, or whatever the case may be, from a lying down position, and the vestibular system, because the otocodia have been displaced, is saying we're moving all over the place. We have drastic changes, and that doesn't match up with our eyes just saying all we did was stand up. So that is going to round out our balance and the ear notes, and then we're going to move into touch. We're going to review touch from what we talked about in our skin unit.